Aether Raids. The most divisive game mode in Fire Emblem Heroes. A game mode where you can have the most glorious of victories, or the most crushing of defeats. A game mode that is either loved or hated. Today on the FEH Report, we trace our steps back in time to the beginning so we can look at the history of the first year of the Aether Raids Meta. A game mode that would reignite the passions of the FEH community. Truly, this time period, I will dub as the pre-meta, would be a joyous time. A time of creativity and fun. A time where anything was allowed and experimentation was celebrated. A simpler time, before people were even able to have fully unlocked teams. Remember, the extra slots in offense and defense were tied to the tier you were in. It was a time before the meta and its iron grip on the player base. It was a time period of absolute fairness and unforgiving failure. This was a time where everyone scored equally per match. There were no mythic boosts to scoring, no merges to inflate scores, no mythic buffs to inflate stats, to the insane numbers we have today. After people reached tier 11, a few weeks after release, it would prove to be a punishing time as well. After all, there was no escape ladder to save you from your failures on offense, or defense mythics to save your lift when your defense was crushed. It was also a great period of learning. During this time, many skills that were never used would begin to get the spotlight. Before the introduction of Aether Raids, Smite was largely considered a useless assist skill, but quickly people began to see its value in Aether Raids offense, with it allowing people to safely activate or test traps. On the other side of the map, new AI manipulation strategies would become prominent in Aether Raids defense, such as the Rally Trap or the Restore Trap. Both would allow unknowing players to be caught with their pants down as a unit they didn't expect would extend the enemy threat range or possibly be danced to destroy unprepared units. As this joyous period quickly passed us, a few powerful units would begin to make themselves known to the world, and the meta would begin to take form. The true first meta of Aether Raids would begin with the introduction of Book 3 and our first Mythic Hero, Air. Air would bring in a plethora of changes that would establish the first meta, though many of these changes would only affect Light Season, and Astra Season would remain the Wild West of Aether Raids, where anything was free game. The first and most radical change would be the Mythic scoring system, which would grant players more lift if they had Mythic units on their team. Not only that, merges would add additional score, offering a way for whales and orb hoarders to get a leg up on their competition. If that wasn't enough, Mythic units would offer a stat buff to anyone who shared their elemental blessing. In the case of Air, offering 5 HP and resistance to all Light Blessed units. This would immediately form the meta around Air and her blessings. Another major change would be the introduction of the escape ladder. Before this, losses were soul crushing, and even losing units on offense could lead to major differences in the tiers players were able to reach. But now the escape ladder would offer 3 get out of jail cards, a season to everyone. Air's release would mark a change in the game mode, but she wouldn't be the only unit that the meta began to form around. Air's release banner would be one of the most influential. It was a Hero Fest banner with 5% focus and 7 free summoning tickets. And while players would be focused on getting extra copies of Air, another unit on the banner was skyrocketing in popularity. Ophelia's power was undeniable, and with her inclusion on the Hero Fest banner, her availability was too. As you probably already know, Ophelia's tome Mistletoe allowed Ophelia to easily charge her special, which allowed her to destroy the most powerful tanks as well as anyone unlucky enough to get in her way. She would quickly become one of the most powerful units in the Aether Raids defense and help to establish the use of Infantry pulse teams, especially as another powerful player in the Aether Raids meta would take the stage. Another extremely powerful unit that would force its way into the meta would be the unlovable Sutr. Sutr was a complete menace of a unit to deal with. With his free AoE damage from his weapon, his free guard from his new premier tier 4 skill, Steady Stance 4, massive bulk for the time, which would be reinforced with Air's Mythic Blessing, increasing his resistance to annoying levels. Also his Preference C skill that not only buffed him +4 to all stats, but also debuffed -4 to all stats to anyone within 2 spaces. Sutr quickly became a meta warping problem, and this was inflated by 2 major factors. First, Sutr was released on a 2-character banner, alongside Ylgr. This means that Sutr was extremely easy to summon, and because he was also one of the highest scoring units at the time for Arena, people were often max merging him, which wasn't a ridiculous thing to do at all. Because of this banner, it could be easily done with 1,000 orbs or less. The second factor was Sutr was given a 3-week bonus season alongside the release of Air. This meant Sutr was at an all-time high power level in Aether Raids. Sutr could literally just be thrown into the enemy team, tank the entire enemy team, and then slowly kill them as they burned alive from his AoE damage. Sutr quickly warped the new meta around him, and hard counters started to appear all over defense teams. Axe Breaker quickly became a meta skill. Armor Slayers were everywhere, and the demand for red mages was never higher. Luckily for the meta, the Queen of Aether Raids was there to save them from their plight. If there was one unit that was literally everywhere in Aether Raids, it had to be the Queen, Aversa. Aversa had premiered as a powerful free-to-play red flying mage at the end of October. While many people thought she was powerful, no one knew at the time just how powerful of a gift the player base had been given. Aversa was the perfect unit for the premiere of AR. First, she was the perfect unit type as a red flying mage. This allowed her to not only support the team through her weapon, but also support through flying mobility. She also hit the enemy's resistance, which would prove crucial in her part of countering the threat that would be Sutr. But what really made Aversa the queen of AR was the map-wide panic her weapon offered. Aversa could easily shut down teams that relied on buffs, and the best part was she could do it on offense and defense. On either side of the map, she was a consistent annoying threat, and that wasn't even considering her actual in-combat functionality. Her availability as a free-to-play unit allowed her to become one of the most dominant forces in Aether Raids, and that's not including the fact she was easily mergeable with the new heroic Grail currency that was just introduced. Even with all of Aversa's utility and power, Sutr could still be problematic, so the defense meta began to evolve to deal with this menace once and for all. The evolution would be an unsightly monster that would quickly become the plague of the Aether Raids, as it spread like wildfire. The Fire Sweep healer meta was here, and it would bring with it the first dark era of the Aether Raids. The Fire Sweep meta consisted of powerful units that could not be counterattacked. The most prominent units amongst their ranks would be Brave Veronica and Brave Lyn, though other units like Elise, Nana, and Roderick were also common. This meta was difficult to deal with for a multitude of reasons. Taking these teams were dangerous as they often had 1 to 2 dancers, which would allow the uncounterable unit to either hit the tank multiple times until they were dead, or run right by them and kill a unit on the back line. Hit and run was also difficult due to good trap placement stopping units from doing reposition loops or getting off proper smites. Mystic Boost was also extremely limited at the time, only available to air, which meant that these units were taking full damage from the Razzle Dazzle healers. Most importantly was the map design though. In early Aether Raids, several maps were degenerately built. They had a high amount of unpassable spaces via walls or lava tiles, and this allowed the player base to make restrictive maps for the enemy to fight against. It often made it impossible to approach safely, or it could force the player to spend several turns clearing buildings out of the way. When you add rally traps, restore traps, and the new Dancer Queen legendary Azura on top of this fiasco, you have a recipe for cancer. The Fire Sweep healer meta was here, and it would become the gatekeeper stopping so many players from reaching the coveted tier 21. But even during these dark times, a few of the best players would rise into the highest area of the Aether Keep, tier 21. A legendary post made by one of these players would explode on the Fire Emblem Heroes Reddit. The post by Fairy MMM would detail how they got into tier 21 through the power of a close counter Vantage Jenny build. While this post itself would not be the reason for the meta shift yet to come, it would be a sign of the Vantage meta soon to sweep through the keep. Shortly after this post, I would make it into the exclusive tier 21 club through the use of a close counter Vantage Jafar, and also an extremely degenerate Brave Lyn plus Brave Veronica Restore Rally Trap map. At the time, the amount of people in tier 21 was minuscule. I would literally play the first match of the week and already be in the top 50 to 100 players. Putting that aside for now, the other major change that came with the new year of 2019 would be the long-awaited Radiant Dawn banner. This banner had Tibern, Rayson, Leanne, but most importantly Nyla on it. While the units on this banner were all great units, the introduction of one skill would forever change the meta: Null C Disrupt. While Nyla was in no means a free-to-play unit, she did offer a counter to the destructive meta that had developed, and she was also the ultimate fodder, offering both distant counter and Null C, though it wouldn't be until March that 4 skills were inheritable from one unit. Null C would be the skill that shed light on the first dark age of Aether Raids, and instead introduced one of the greatest periods of Aether Raids to date. With the fun of the second anniversary over, we will receive patch 3.2, which would be one of the most meta-impactful patches to date. Version 3.2 would introduce tiers 22 to 27 to Aether Raids, and would have players reset back to tier 21 at the beginning of each week. This allowed more room for the most competitive players to face off against each other, and some of the most grueling maps to exist up until this point. But this wouldn't be the only change. The biggest changes would actually come in the nerfing of the two most popular maps, Spring Breeze and Lava Flows. Spring Breeze would have its two upper walls made breakable. Lava Flows would have one of its lava patches moved down and to the right, making it easier for offensive teams to attack. These two changes would further help put an end to the healer meta that wasn't completely gone yet. Though Null C did offer a direct counter to the healer meta, it wasn't accessible to many players. But these map changes would allow for a variety of strategies to be able to attack and win against these teams. 3 other major quality of life changes will also hit the game, with the removal of Banes via merging, Dragon Flowers being added, and the removal of the free daily match and the rebalancing of ether cost. The first 2 of these changes would drastically help free-to-play units claim a part of the new meta that was emerging. The third change allowed the entire player base to take a collective sigh of relief, as it meant no longer having to play every single day to remain competitive. They instead could play a couple matches in a single day and then take a day off later in the week, though they still need to play at least 5 days a week to collect all the rewards. The final meta changing part of the patch would come in an unusual way. Due to the patch coming out mid-week and its drastic changes to ether cost, the week prior to the patch had an extended Aether Raids week. Unlike the typical 7-day Aether Raid cycle, instead there would be a 9-day cycle. This was an absolutely massive boon to thousands of players trying to make it into the coveted Tier 21. Up to this point, it was necessary to play offense extremely well, have a solid defense, and have 2 airs or merges on air to make it into Tier 21. But these 2 additional days would throw wide the gates of Tier 21 to the masses. Tier 21 went from hundreds of players to thousands. The new emerging meta would consist of a myriad of strategies for both offense and defense, but some new powerful strategies begin to rise in prominence. One of these strategies would be the close counter Vantage strategy. Very MMM lit the way for many players to follow in their footsteps. The close counter Vantage strategy quickly proved to be highly versatile and powerful. It allowed the player to use a range carry to snipe many of the dangerous threats on a defense map, then clear the rest of the team with Vantage. What made this strategy in particularly good was its ability to snipe buildings, then reposition to safety with the help of dancers. It also allowed the carry to take out healing fountains, which would let the offense player's bolt tower cripple the enemy team. The other great thing about this strategy was that it was extremely free-to-play friendly. While I originally used Jafar for this strategy, the much better options tended to be Blade Tome mages, such as Nino, Tharja, or even Tailtu, which were all in the 3 to 4 star pool. Another great option could be high attack archers, who could perform well against a new defense archetype, the Flier Ball, which we'll discuss later. The Vantage meta became so prominent so quickly that the Aether Raids defense had to adapt quickly, and the answer came in a long-forgotten seal, Hardy Bearing. The Hardy Bearing seal had been given out in the 3rd Tempest trial that took back in August 2017, and had seen almost no use until Aether Raids arrived. Hardy Bearing had been in the meta before, but now it became a mandatory part of every Aether Raids defense team. The Vantage meta also increased the prominence of units that could counter this strategy. The defense meta evolved by putting more units that could hard counter these Vantage units, such as more healers, fire sweep units, and some seasonal dancers like Dancer Micaiah, Ryoma, Xander, or Alencia. These units all had Hardy Bearing built into their weapons. Amongst them though, Micaiah proved to be the best choice in most situations. She had a preference red tome with armor and cavalry effectiveness, and high attack, allowing her to not only kill units in Vantage range, but also often land killing blows on annoying Surters or cavalry units. The meta also began to make more use of the Panic Manor building, which would cripple these Vantage sweepers that often relied on being fully buffed. Another adaptation to defense teams would come in a new archetype, the Flier Ball. As free-to-play strategies began to flood into the meta on offense, a new powerful free-to-play friendly defense archetype would emerge into the skies of Aether Raids, the Flier Ball. The name came from the fact that the team was composed of 6 flying units that supported each other via the C skills Ward Flyers and Goad Flyers. These 2 skills allowed them to become a powerful wall of stats, but what made the defense exceptionally scary was the unique mobility options available to Flyers via skills such as Flyer's Guidance, Air Orders, but most commonly, Flyer Formation. These skills allowed the flying units to teleport to each other, not only making it more difficult to predict who would attack or in what order, but also the true threat range of the team. If that wasn't enough, it allowed the Flier Ball to stick together, solidifying their support for one another even past turn 1. The largest variable that allowed Flier Balls to become one of the core defense maps in the Aether Raids meta would be how accessible it was to everyone. Many of the most powerful units for a Flier Ball were in the 3 to 4 star pool, and also the Flier Ball had tons of options, which would allow it to be flexible to deal with all different types of meta threats. Some examples of units that were great in the Flier Ball at the time were Camilla, who could offer an extra 4 attack and speed via her preference weapon, Xerxes, who could offer panic support through her weapon, but more importantly had a high attack stat and a preference brave weapon that could smash through many of the powerful tanks in Aether Raids. Est, whose powerful refine granted her armor effectiveness and the ability to quad, which would destroy almost any tank foolish enough to stand in her way, including a max-powered Sutr. There were a ton of options for every role. Dancers had Raisin, New Year's Azura, and even the vaunted legendary Azura. You could have powerful Blade Tome mages like Summer Corrin or Halloween Noe, who worked well after being danced by a legendary Azura. Bohanoka was another powerful 5-star option, and this is just scratching the surface. The fact that so many of these options were in the 3 to 4 star pool also meant it was easy to max merge these units and bolster their stats even further. The Rally Trap also performed miracles in this defense team, as it allowed units from the back line to jump all the way past the front line to destroy unaware units that stepped too close to the Ball of Death. One last variable that would help the Flier Ball would be the addition of Yoon, a dark mythic hero added in March. While Yoon herself wasn't the most powerful unit, she could be quite deadly with the right build. But more importantly, Yoon offered a myriad of support. First, Yoon granted a dark mythic buff that gave 5 HP and 4 speed. This would allow the Flier Ball to become more difficult to crack, as it could offer enough speed to keep your frontliners from being doubled by CC Vantage units. Secondly, she offered debuffs in the form of her preference skill, Chaos Named, which acted like a ploy skill but covered 3 columns instead of 1. It also debuffed the unit's strongest stat, which could often prevent the unit from being able to kill your units or weaken their defenses enough for your Flier Ball to smash right through them. Even though Yoon did offer a boon to the Flier Ball meta, defensive mythics were still mostly viewed as a joke at this point, and many players would choose to summon offensive mythics instead. Intelligent Systems would address this in patch 3.3, but it would prove not to be enough. This would be the first of many buffs and changes to defense mythics in an attempt to get players to summon for them. May would prove to be a massive month for the Aether Raids meta. First, we would receive patch 3.5, which would introduce the Dark and Bright Shrine buildings, 2 powerful buildings that could debuff units' attack and speed by -5, or their defense and resistance by -5. Both of these buildings would become a huge thorn to one of the other meta strategies that existed since the beginning of Aether Raids, but had risen to prominence after the release of Null Sea Disrupt, Omni Tanking. Omni Tanking was a strategy that revolved around creating one extremely powerful unit that would face off against the enemy team. The key to success with this strategy was properly supporting the Omni Tank with powerful supports, a good understanding of AI manipulation to dodge or take advantage of rally traps or restore traps, a good understanding of positioning, and lastly, understanding matchups so the Omni Tank could secure kills. If a player didn't understand these aspects of the strategy, often the unit on the enemy team could survive and be danced to snipe backline supports. While I may have made the strategy sound difficult, the reality was that it was much easier than other strategies, such as close counter Vantage, sweeping, or Gale Force. Most of the success of the team would come in the preparations before the match. The player would need to ensure the Omni Tank had a solid build. Their supports had skills that could cripple the enemy team, such as Panic or Chill Attack or Chill Speed, and most importantly, with the introduction of the Dark and Bright Shrine, a way to soak chills off your tank. The last thing you wanted was your tank getting hit by debuffs that could result in them missing kills, or even worse, dying. Supports also ran a ton of buffing skills, such as the Tactics or Link skills to ensure the Omni Tank had the max amount of stats possible. What made Omni Tanking the go-to strategy in Aether Raids was a few factors. First, the quality of life changes of 3.2 in February were a massive boon to tanks. The removal of Banes via merging offered tanks more stats, which they desperately needed. And speaking of stats, Dragon Flowers could offer up to 10 more BST to tanks if they were infantry, which many of them were. You add the introduction of Null Sea and it becomes clear that a powerful tank could take on almost any team. Another factor that made Omni Tanking extremely popular was once again the availability of free-to-play units. Many of the best tanks would come in the form of high BST free-to-play units such as Noe, Donal, Faye, or even Libra. My personal preference was the Pothead Donal, who had extra BST due to being a villager even though he was a Gen 1 unit. Another aspect to what made Omni Tanking popular was how easy it was to build great supports. Among the best were Air, Aversa, Male Corrin, and of course Legendary Azura. Air offered resistance and HP through a mythic buff, as well as healing through her preference C skill, Sparkling Boost. As we talked about earlier, Aversa offered the powerful map-wide panic, as well as -3 to all stats on the enemy team. Next was Male Corrin, who was easily the most versatile support in the meta. Corrin received the powerful Refined Yato that offered his support partner +4 to all stats. Combined with the ally support buff itself, this could grant up to +6 to all stats, though more often it would be +5 to all stats, due to not wanting Corrin adjacent to your Omni Tank. The Yato Refine also granted Corrin +2 to all stats to himself, which would allow him to bolster his BST. While typically BST is one of the factors you are least concerned about when building a support, Corrin was in a unique position, where depending on his build, he could soak any chill for your tank. You could put Life and Death on him and have him soak Bright Shrine, or Fortress Defense Res 3 and have him soak a Dark Shrine. That wasn't even talking about his B and C skill, or his Seal slot, which could offer support through chills, tactic buffs, or even drives. Corrin would prove to be one of the most powerful supports in the game, and the best part was that he was completely free to play. The ultimate support unit would come in the form of the legendary hero, Azura. Legendary Azura was a completely busted dancer, and remains one of the best dancers of the game even to today. Legendary Azura's preference weapon, Prayer Wheel, granted a bonus to all stats equal to the highest bonus already on the unit. This effect would be powerful by itself, but due to a bug, if Azura was equipped with a dancing seal, like Earth Dance 3, instead of just granting +5 to defense, it would grant +5 to all stats. Instead of removing this bug, intelligence systems reported it to the player base and said, enjoy. If that wasn't enough, Legendary Azura also had a preference dance skill, known as Grey Waves. Grey Waves grants an extra space of movement to infantry and flying units. The combination of these two effects easily made Azura the most powerful support in the game, in both offense and defense. Her support on offense allowed close counter Vantage strategies to pull off amazing snipe plays, and on defense, her dancing could cause defense units to become berserking monsters that would charge at your team, destroying them. Legendary Azura was everywhere in the meta, and this was partially due to her being one of the possible free-to-play options from the 2nd anniversary. If you were as unlucky as I was and didn't get Legendary Azura for free, then you could summon her on a special 2nd anniversary banner. Now that we've discussed the most premium support in the game, let's discuss some other premium tanking options. While Omni Tanking was largely a free-to-play strategy, that isn't to say there weren't any 5-star exclusive options. May would introduce one of the most powerful options at the time, Fallen Corrin. At the time, Fallen Corrin was an absurd unit with an extremely high BST that was further improved with a villager bonus of +5 for some unknown reason. She also had one of the most absurd weapons, Savage Breath, which could grant up to +6 to all stats. Corrin was a monstrous unit that could take on whole teams by herself, and many whales threw their wallets at IS to make sure they had max merges. Another premium option came out earlier in the year with Mufasa, who had released in April. Mufasa was our first armored beast, and his weapon not only had distant counter built in, but could also grant +4 to all stats if the foe initiated combat. Combining this powerful weapon with the absurd fighter skills, such as Special Fighter, allowed Mufasa to become one of the premier tanks in Aether Raids. While the introductions of the Dark Shrine, Bright Shrine, and Fallen Corrin were all small impacts in the meta that came in May, several more important ones were on their way. The first shakeup to the meta we'll discuss is the introduction of Naga. Naga was our first Astra Mythic, which was a massive deal to the Astra season. Up to this point, Astra season had been considered the more difficult season, and was much more of a wild area. Light season had the powerful Air, as well as her powerful resistance mythic buff, which allowed Omni Tanking to grab a large portion of the meta. But in Astra season, there was no such thing. While Naga would bring along a powerful defense mythic blessing, it wouldn't be nearly useful as Airs. Since the beginning of Aether Raids, mages and other resistance targeting units were highly preferred, and Naga would offer no help for the Astra season against these horrifying threats. Though she would offer dragon effectiveness through her unique preference skill, Divine Fang. Divine Fang would be the first wooden stake nailed into the hearts of dragons in Astra season, but it wouldn't be the last. The other massive change Naga introduced was the ability to score more in Astra season. Up until this point, everyone had equal grounding in Astra season when it came to score, but no more. Whales and Orb Hoarders would have the chance to pick up several copies of Naga to bolster their scores and claim the highest ranks. The second shakeup to the meta would come in the form of the Bridal banner, which would introduce two powerful anti-meta weapons. The first being Isolation, a status effect that prevents a unit from using or being targeted by any assist skill. This means that a unit wouldn't be able to be rallied or danced. Isolation would become the silver bullet necessary to destroy many of the most powerful traps in Aether Raids, such as the Rally Trap or the Restore Trap. The one thing that kept these defense maps alive and kicking would be the rarity of Bridal Fjorm herself. She was available on a seasonal banner, and she was a 5-star, the lowest bracket of availability possible. Not only that, she was a colorless unit, which at the time was one of the worst colors to summon on. Even so, Bridal Fjorm's impact on the meta would be felt. The highest level of Aether Raids where the whales scurried about were filled with Bridal Fjorms, shutting down many of the most powerful defense teams. The Bridal banner would not stop there though. It would also introduce the powerful Pulse Smoke C skill, a smoke skill that would inflict special cooldown count +1 on foes within 2 spaces. This powerful skill could now be used to reset the specials of enemies on defense maps, which was a massive hit to Infantry Pulse teams, one of the premier defenses in the keep. Luckily for all the Infantry Pulse team users, me included, Pent was a 5-star seasonal exclusive, landing himself in the lowest bracket of availability. Unlike Fjorm, Pulse Smoke would rarely be seen in the meta for quite a while. Not only was it a 5-star exclusive skill, it was tied to a less than powerful unit in the form of Bridal Pent. So in order to make full use of the skill, a player would need to fire him off to a better user. Though a weapon had been created to pierce the heart of the Infantry Pulse meta, that would not be enough to slow it down, especially with the new toys on the horizon. Update 3.6 would hit in June 2019, and with it would come several more nerfs to maps such as Abandoned Castle, Snow Dust, and Spring Breeze. Maps that had become the most commonly used maps since the map nerfs of 3.2. Abandoned Castle would see the walls in the second and third columns become breakable, while Snow Dust would also have the column in its first row become breakable. And lastly, Spring Breeze would follow a similar fate, with its rightmost column becoming breakable too. These changes would once again allow the offense players to have a larger advantage over the defense maps, making it easier than ever to conquer some of the most powerful defense maps that were plaguing the meta. But if you thought that was enough to tip the scales, then you were wrong, because Infantry Pulse teams were about to get a powerful new toy. July couldn't come soon enough for many FEH players. The release of the long-awaited Three Houses game was on the horizon, and FEH had no plans of letting the game pass by without affecting the meta. In the later part of July, we would receive our first of many Three Houses banners in FEH. This banner, alongside the Mythic Sothis banner, would introduce a plethora of premium options for skill inheritance. The new Heroes banner would introduce Ruptured Sky on both byleths, a powerful 2 cooldown special that even scored well in Arena. Dimitri and Claude would be the first to introduce the powerful Lull skills, which could neutralize foes' bonuses and inflict -3 to both stats. Putting aside those powerful skills, Time's Pulse, introduced by Sothis herself, would prove to be a powerful new skill that would allow for cooldown reduction at a premium. Infantry Pulse teams would cry in joy at the introduction of this new skill, and it would be just the thing needed to make these horrifying teams even stronger. By this point, Infantry Pulse teams were a foundation in the defense meta. Infantry Pulse teams were originally designed to offer defense teams the power they needed to blow through powerful tanks, such as Sutr in the early days of Aether Raids. Over time, they had evolved and become more powerful. They often acted as the counter to the common Omni Tank strategies. Infantry Pulse teams could allow the defense to have powerful specials like Luna, Ignis, Glacies, or AoE specials charged up and ready to smash any tank arrogant enough to get close. Once again, these defense maps would be bolstered with the use of Rally Traps, which would allow the most powerful units to hide in the back lines, only to teleport up and destroy enemies. Rally Traps also allowed IP teams to extend their range dramatically, which could be a problem for the team, which was composed mostly of infantry units. Amongst Infantry Pulse teams, Ophelia still remained Queen. Her weapon allowed for her special to be easily charged, and her attack ensured AoEs would be devastating. But there would be a few other units that would take their place on the Infantry Pulse teams. One such unit would be Sonya. Dark Excalibur had received a powerful refine that granted it special cooldown -2 at the beginning of turn 1, on top of the +10 damage when special triggers it already had. These two powerful effects would make Sonya a deadly force in Infantry Pulse teams, where she could launch massive glacies into the enemy tank, destroying them. Other great units on Infantry Pulse teams would be free-to-play dancers, such as Olivia or Sylvia, which could easily be merged up and given HP skills to allow them to Infantry Pulse other units on their teams. On the premium side, there was Ninian and Dancer Micaiah. Ninian had a respectable HP stat, which made her a great choice for Infantry Pulse. Dancer Micaiah, on the other hand, could be a powerful nuke in the form of a dancer, but more importantly, she offered another source of hardy bearing built into her weapon, which could scare off players who wanted to use the close counter Vantage strategy. While there are plenty of other options for Infantry Pulse teams, such as Kagero with her new Refine, a tank shredding Menace had made his way into the keep. The release of Legendary Alm was a nightmare for many of the Omni Tank players in Aether Raids. Legendary Alm was a completely busted unit at the time. Not only did he come with 35 attack and 35 speed, but he had the ridiculously powerful Luna Arc, a preference bow that offered 25% true damage per hit. Alm would quickly become a staple in the Aether Raids meta, as he shredded through many of the most powerful tanks in AR, and he even came with no follow-up to ensure he doubled. If that wasn't enough, Alm would make his way onto Infantry Pulse teams, where he could choose between his own powerful preference skill, Lunar Flash, to be pre-charged, or even a Luna. A thing to remember as well was the defense mythics weren't meta at this point, so even though Legendary Alm was an Earth Legendary, he was ran no matter what season it was. The defense meta largely revolved around getting kills to reduce lift loss, instead of relying on defense mythics or bonus defense mythics like we do now. As strong as the Infantry Pulse and defense meta was, clear counters had been established, though their availability was quite limited. In response to the newly added defense rewards by Intelligent Systems, defense players began to construct a new defense archetype to ensure they were getting max rewards. A defense team that could ignore the annoyance of Bridal Fjorm, close counter Vantage units, and could even ignore the powerful Omni Tanks. That defense archetype would be the Cav Line. A cavalry line is a defense team that consists typically of 5 ranged cavalry units, spread out in a line formation. The team would immediately engage on the offensive player as long as one unit was in range of any of these cavalry units. At the time, it was quite common to run several buildings in the bottom row, which meant there was almost never enough room to completely hide your units. This also meant that often your support unit or mythics were in range of one of these deadly cavalry units. The team would immediately smash into the player's team, and while some of the cavalry units may die to the player's powerful tank, the rest of their team would be decimated. The defense team immediately proved to be super effective and quickly carved a place in the defense meta. The key players of this meta-defining archetype were once again free-to-play units, whose availability made them easily mergeable, such as the Magic King, the small-handed destroyer, Reinhardt himself. Units like Nana, who could be extremely difficult to deal with not only due to dazzling staff, but the high variety of staff options she had like Panic Plus or Flash Plus, just to name a few. There were also a ton of premium cavalry options to choose from, like Brave Lyn, who would once again refuse to leave the meta and continue to destroy alongside her best friend Reinhardt. There was also units like Gunthra, Ursula, Mage Erica, the annoyance known as Brave Veronica, Cecilia, and so many more. Cav lines were highly customizable and extremely deadly. Due to the layout of a typical cav line, the defense buildings were also well protected in the back line, which meant the often mocked Aether Raids defense skills were actually amazing now, as they could grant plus 10 to 2 different stats. Though at the inception of the cav line, they were still quite difficult to get, other than ARD, Speed, and Res, which was available on Mercedes, who was demoted. The cav line was by no means a perfect defense, but defeating it required a level of AI knowledge and skill that a majority of the player base did not have at the time. Even so, the meta would continue on. August wouldn't bring about any dramatic changes for the meta, but it would introduce the new Hero Fest banner, which contained Nyla, Sutr, Tibarn, and Fallen Tiki. Nyla and Tibarn were still sought after units, not only for their own power, but more for the powerful Null C Disrupt and Sturdy Impact skill. Nyla was still the only source of Null C in the game, and had only been on 2 banners before the Hero Fest, so this banner would be the chance for many players to get their hands on this coveted skill. On the other hand, Sturdy Impact was a powerful skill, especially on ARD, where it could completely shut down many of the powerful Omni tanks. The other major reveal of August would come in the form of the new Brave heroes, Alm, Micaiah, Eliwood, and Camilla. While the units were great and looked amazing, they lacked the meta impact that prior CYL units had, like Brave Lyn or Brave Veronica. These CYL units would not be the ones to change the meta. No, that would come at the hands of the ultimate power couple, soon to arrive. September 2019 would tear the Aether Raids meta open. Version 3.9 would be a massive patch that would introduce some major features to help players in Aether Raids. First, the Escape Ladder would get its first upgrade since release, now maxing out at 4 uses. This would help the players struggling on offense. Next, the patch would introduce the wonderful Heroes Path system. Heroes Path would be a great system to help new players, offering them a ton of free currency to get their account started, such as Divine Dew, Refining Stones, Sacred Seals, and so much more. But more importantly, it would introduce 3 more units into the free-to-play pool: Mage Erica, Ninian, and Brave Ike. This would put these 3 units into the highest availability bracket. Now, while Mage Erica and Ninian were good units, Brave Ike would soon transcend into godhood. Version 3.9 would offer refines to the winners of the very first Choose Your Legends: Brave Ike, Brave Lynn, Brave Lucina, and Brave Roy. Also, there was Eliwood, that guy who stole his son's claim to fame and would further push Roy down into the darkness of meta irrelevance. Brave Roy would receive a powerful refine that offered special fighter and steady impact on initiation. Brave Lynn would get a measly +4 to all stats if she won a visible speed check, unfortunately a side effect of her meta dominance. Brave Ike and Brave Lucina, though, will receive 2 of the most powerful refines to exist. Lucina's weapon would now give an Omni Drive buff to Sword, Lance, Axe, Bow, Dagger, and Beast units, but also the coveted Steady Breath effect. This amazingly powerful effect would skyrocket Lucina from irrelevance to the top of the meta. Not only that, she would prove to be the best partner to the new king of Aether Raids. On release, Brave Ike was an okay unit. Irvin was in an awkward place where if Ike used Distant Counter, the weapon's effect would turn off in most cases. To say the least, Brave Ike was much more known as Steady Breath fodder than anything else. But his refine would change that. His refine would grant 40% damage reduction against the foe's first attack, and 80% damage reduction against any consecutive attack after that. What made the weapon ridiculous was that it forced the engaging units to perform their attacks before Ike would counterattack, reducing the 2 attacks damage to almost nothing. If that wasn't enough, with Brave Lucina's help, he could retaliate with a fully charged Aether, destroying the enemy. Brave Ike immediately became the premier tank of Aether Raids, and began to shut down defense teams. Not only was he powerful, but he was a great user of Null Sea Disrupt, which allowed him to deal with pesky healers. He could also run a powerful speed build that took advantage of Null follow-up. The meta immediately began to warp around Brave Ike and Lucina. The defense meta had to make changes quick or they'd be swept up by Brave Ike. The answer to Brave Ike came in the form of a long-time Aether Raid staple, the Hardy Bearing Seal. While typically the Hardy Bearing Seal was there to ensure the map wasn't Vantage swept, now it was being used to ensure Brave Ike didn't get his full damage reduction. The value of red units skyrocketed, as players were desperate to find solutions to Brave Ike and Lucina. Units like Dancer Micaiah became invaluable, as not only was she red, but she had Hardy Bearing as well. Flier Ball started to bring in units like Pala, who had Triangle Adept 3 built into her weapon, hoping to overwhelm Brave Ikes. Though the meta would adapt and evolve to handle Brave Ike would remain as one of the most powerful units in Aether Raids. If that wasn't enough, September would premiere one more meta Menace, this time on ARD. That unit would come in the form of the new Anima Mythic, Thrasir. Thrasir would prove to be the final stake hammered into the heart of dragons in Astra season. Thrasir was absurdly powerful, but even more so against dragons, which her weapon was effective against. She also had color triangle advantage against Noe, the most common of the dragon tanks. Thrasir's weapon and preference skill, Killing Intent, could grant Thrasir a ton of stats, while also granting a desperation effect if the enemy was below 100% HP or had a penalty on them. This desperation effect, in combination with Flashing Blade 4, would allow her to attack twice and proc her special before the enemy even had a chance to retaliate. And this was with no help from any pulse effects. Thrasir would be the first defense mythic that truly felt powerful and worthwhile to run on your defense team. In October, we would receive a new powerful unit type, the Duo Hero. It would also be the introduction of Duo's Hindrance and Duo's Indulgence. Though Duo Heroes and Duo's Hindrance would become a larger part of the meta, their introduction was underwhelming to say the least. Duo Hector ended up being nothing more than a glorified bolt tower for some close counter Vantage strats. Neither of the duo buildings would see any play at the time, and even the next new duo unit, Duo Ephraim, wouldn't prove to be a meta shifting unit, though he would prove to be better than Hector. As the end of the first year of Aether Raids approached, there would be one final hurrah of the year. That would come in the final Mythic of the year, Altina. Altina would be the second Astra Mythic available to players, and she came with one of the most absurd preference weapons to date. Altina wielded both Ragnell and Elondite, weapons known for being wielded by Ike and Zelgius. The preference weapon granted distant counter and a dual phase brave effect. If that wasn't absurd enough, she came with two preference skills, Asher's Chosen and Twin Blades. Asher's Chosen granted Altina Iot's Shield and attack defense solo. This ensured that Altina would be able to be a powerful Vantage tank. Twin Blades, on the other hand, seemed like the answer the player base had been waiting for. It boosted damage by 40% of the unit's resistance and disabled non-special damage reduction. Many players finally saw the answer to the Aether Raids king, Brave Ike, but there was one major problem. Altina was an offense mythic, meaning she would only be dealing with the occasional Brave Ike on defense. Altina also had a few other problems as well. Her stat line was a bit awkward. She had good attack, defense, and resistance, but due to her weapon only granting 10 might, she could struggle to kill even with brave hits. It became clear that Altina would need an attack IV and some investment to show off her true potential. Even with all these negatives, the player base went absolutely nuts over Altina. All of a sudden, Altina was everyone's favorite character, even though she had only been in one image and one cutscene in Radiant Dawn. She was extremely popular, and the popularity would carry straight through the new year to the next anniversary. But that's a story for the next video. With Altina's banner coming to an end, players sat in quiet anticipation, wondering what would arrive with the introduction of Book 4. What wondrous land will we travel to? What mythic will we get for free, if we got one at all? How would Aether Raids be changed? But even with all the anticipation and theory crafting going on, no one would be ready for what was about to come. If you made it through the entire video, thank you so much for watching. I'm sorry I wasn't able to cover the entire Aether Raids meta in one video, but I completely underestimated how big of an undertaking this would be. I had to spend countless hours going through version updates, summoning archives, and hours of video to make sure the timeline was correct. So if you enjoyed the video, please drop a like and subscribe. That would mean the world to me. I'd also like to say a massive thank you to Acarus for many of his Aether Raids videos he has on his channel. It was extremely difficult to find any footage of early AR gameplay, and his channel was indispensable for that. So please go subscribe to his channel, the link will be down in the description. Also, any other video footage I used will be in the description down below. Okay, we'll be back with the next episode of the FEH Report, where we will continue to cover the history of the Aether Raids meta.